Hey there everyone! Today in this video I'm going to discuss the first half of the magic system for the Omnivermis Mythos. So the main universe, the one most similar to our reality out of all those currently known, is Univermis-Alpha. So one concept I thought would be pretty cool to include would be the idea of completely separate magic systems within the same setting, and there's only interaction between them in certain really specific cases. But that's the exception, not the rule. So in the real world, we have similarly unrelated forces that we can actually observe. For example, gravity and electromagnetism aren't really correlated, but they both have major effects on our lives. So electromagnetism, you got like electricity, magnets, light, radio waves, stuff like that. That's a major component of all our modern technology, but that is totally unrelated to gravity. Gravity also has a major effect on our lives, because without it, planets couldn't exist. Matter wouldn't conglomerate into these big planets. We just happen to live on a planet, so we kind of need the gravity. Now, my idea is to integrate two magic systems into the setting. There's going to be, and this is for Univermis-Alpha specifically, they're going to be capable of interacting with each other, but like I had said before, just barely, and they're kind of going to be their own things. So you can have one and not the other. It's not different subsections of the same magic system. It's just two different systems that coexist within Univermis-Alpha. So in light of spooky season, which has come upon us much faster than I was actually ready for, I wanted to explain the other system first, because that one's kind of more spooky-y. But I was kind of running out of time, and then I decided it was best to cover this type of magic first, and this is physically separated interaction. The main idea behind the design is exactly what it sounds like, being able to communicate ideas or manipulate objects or kind of move different items without verbal speech or actual interaction. So as a biology and morphology kind of person, I'm kind of a fan of that stuff. I also want to incorporate some sort of biological method by which this magic is actually used. And then lastly, I wanted to make it more of like a hard fiction system, so this one has an intrinsic order, and yes, there can be exceptions, but for the most part, it is internally consistent. So one of my main inspirations for this idea was real-world electronics, which might sound a little bit boring at first, but it's actually super interesting. I'm not going to go over all the details in this video, but I am going to give you just enough information so that you can kind of know what's going on. There's two interesting topics that I wanted to bring to light, and then we can move on to the actual magic. So the first is the invention of the radio antenna. Electrical antennas, and in the plural of that is antennas, not antennae, not like in biology. But electrical antennas are essentially a piece of metal that conducts electricity, but it's designed in a manner so that they can produce electromagnetic waves. So electromagnetic waves, or EM waves, those are things like radio waves, microwaves, infrared, which is heat, visible light, ultraviolet, X-rays, gamma rays. Pretty much any form of radiation that's not a particle, that's an EM wave. So when electrified, the radio antenna will begin to emit these waves just from the electricity going through it. It's shaped in a fashion so that it will emit certain frequencies, certain amplitudes of the waves. And we're able to control that based on really the shape. So us as engineers, whenever we make a radio antenna a certain shape, then we are determining its behavior. So thus, form indicates function. You can look at kind of its design, and then you can see what it's actually meant to do. The second item of interest is the fact that antennae exhibit reciprocity. They're reciprocal. So an electrified antenna will emit electromagnetic waves, but the opposite is also true. Whenever EM waves come into contact with the right design of antenna, then that antenna can actually absorb them, and then that creates a little bit of electricity. So instead of putting electricity in and getting waves out, this is the opposite. You're putting waves in, getting a little bit of electricity out. So these mini pulses, once they're absorbed, they can be redirected to kind of a detection apparatus that senses when they're there. So in fact, that's actually how radios work. The radio antenna receives the signals that are being broadcast by the station or the tower, and then the pattern from whenever that wave goes into the antenna and creates the electricity, that pattern of those pulses go to the circuitry. The pattern really encodes a message, and then that's interpreted by the device, in this case of like an actual radio set, it would be, when you receive this, play this on the speaker. That's the basic principle on which radios operate. They receive messages encoded into the signals, the EM waves, and then once they have that signal and they can interpret it, then they're able to determine what audio to actually play. So now that we've gone over the real world stuff, let's get into the fun part, making magic. So we're going to start crafting the magic system. The basic idea is that physically separated interaction can be abbreviated into an acronym, PSI, with the letters PSI. This works out perfectly because in electrical diagrams, the symbol for an antenna looks like this thing shown on screen, and then there's also a Greek letter called psi, spelled the same way as our acronym, and it looks very similar to the antenna symbol. Thus, we will use the letter psi to denote psi magic. In universe, or in Univermis, I should say, there exists a realm of psi referred to as neurospace. This quote-unquote realm it exists within the timeline. So within the Univermis, remember the timeline is a giant worm, the timeline is in the stomach, but outside of that, there's neurons, there's brain cells. Outer neurospace is the part of this realm, and I say realm in quotes, that isn't bound by the laws of relative time because it's actually outside of the digestive tract. The kind of neurons that are lining the walls, those are relevant to what we're going to discuss today. Those create the alternate. A psychosphere is a network made up of all the physical psi-related components, like organs and glands that actually help a person perform different magical activities. But it should be noted that the psychosphere is largely physical, because it is made up of the individuals who can perform psi, of those psi users. And then there is the part we're going to be more interested in, referred to as the alternate. The alternate is almost like a virtual realm that follows the normal flow of time. So at any given point in the relative timeline, there's always going to be a correlated and an associated version of each person within the alternate. This is called the quintessence. The quintessence is essentially the equivalent of a soul in the Omnivermis Mythos setting, and having a quintessence is what enables one to use psi. And because of this fact, inanimate objects like rocks, or non-living wood, or metals, they can't exhibit psi traits. So you can't have some sort of magical object. The magic is actually intrinsic to that organism. In outer neurospace, the one not bound by relative time, there is the head. There's the parts of the nervous system like the eyes, the antenna. Each antenna of Univermis-Alpha, of which there are 9, will generate a being known as an antennymph, a combination of the words antenna and nymph. So capable of time travel and of altering reality to their will, antennymphs serve to regulate the internal functions of the cosmic worms throughout their bodies, the sections of which we will perceive as time periods. So as you move down the worm, we'd see history. But to them, time is just another spatial dimension, so they can walk around, and we would perceive that as time travel. Now, the specific antennymph in charge of regulating psi and its users is known as the radiolith, a combination of the words radio and monolith. It's a creature, but it's a giant radially symmetrical structure of some sort. Now, within the Paradox Orthodoxy, which is an organization specializing in trying to understand time travel and trying to catalog interactions with verminions, there is debate between different branches about which appearance of the radiolith is the most accurate, and I'll show some of the appearances on screen now, but those are just some of the interpretations of what its appearance might look like, as different figures have encountered it throughout history, and sometimes they'll report encountering different physical forms of the creature. So we've talked about the mechanisms behind psi, but what does it actually do? What are the forms of physically separated interaction? Psi tissue falls into 4 main categories: manipulative, acquisitive, transmissive, and null. Each psi ability, regardless of classification, is enabled by the presence of specific tissues and/or organs. In humans, which are a little bit boring, psi can be enabled by modified nervous tissues, but other sophonts may exhibit entire bodily systems that are devoted to psi functions. Tools can also be used to help channel and amplify one's powers, but that's more of a placebo effect because remember, non-living objects cannot perform psi operations. Manipulative psi includes two power sets. The first is psychokinesis, which allows one to exert kinetic force on the objects in their vicinity. Note that psi produces psychokinesis specifically, not telekinesis. Telekinesis is simply the manipulation of objects, kind of like levitating and without physical contact. Psychokinesis means that it specifically comes from your brain or comes from your mind. And that's kind of an important distinction to make because there might be other ways to levitate things, but psychokinesis is the psi version of telekinesis. This can include pushing and pulling on objects around them, but some psychokinetics, people who are capable of psychokinesis, can actually possess the ability to move themselves, so they can have levitation-enabled flight, and it's not necessarily only works in the air or only underwater, like super fast swimming, but also in vehicles. Imagine a psi-capable human from the medieval ages sitting atop a wagon and using their powers to push in a hindwards direction, creating thrust. This ability is diagrammed using a core for the origin of the powers and drawing a circle to represent their physical range of influence. Another fun concept is the idea of psi guns, which are designed to help the user focus their psychokinesis into potent, bullet-sized beams that can prove lethal to living organisms. The second manipulative psi ability is telepathy distortion. This does not necessarily allow an individual to actually receive or emit the telepathic messages, but instead to alter them. So that would be kind of erasing them from existence, maybe adding things, or disrupting them into just staticky noise. This means it's not really an example of true telepathy or true psychic abilities, and we'll discuss those in a little while. Diagrams of telepathic disruptors contain a core, and then around the core there's a circle with little triangles pointing inwards or outwards as to denote whether the telepathic signals are being attracted or repelled. The next category of psi is known as acquisitive. Acquisitive psi is considered to be a synonym for psychic, meaning that one who possesses these abilities is capable of acquiring information through seemingly anomalous means. Most psychics possess only baseline psychic tissue, drawn in diagrams as a line with different dashes, whenever it's kind of a vein or a specific line of that tissue. And it can also be planar, and when it's planar, that is shown as a grid, whenever there's those flat layers of the tissue. Note that this tissue only acts to detect telepathy, meaning that one can only acquire the information if someone else has already broadcast the signal. This also means that if a creature possesses no psychic ability whatsoever, then they are incapable of sensing and interpreting telepathy. Psychic gleaning, on the other hand, is associated tissue drawn similarly, but with the addition of these little U-shaped curves on some of the dashes. This symbol comes from the shape of a magnet, and when this is actually drawn, the representation looks like the psi symbol. Psychic gleaning is essentially just mind reading, and I say just, but it's really interesting because it allows one not only to actively acquire information from another's thoughts, but also sometimes memories or even what they're perceiving at the time. So imagine being able to see and hear through somebody else's eyes and ears. That's a form or a potential way that psychic gleaning could actually manifest itself. Lastly, there's a variant of baseline psychic tissue, except it's more specialized and for listening in one direction, and then you're able to quote-unquote listen with high sensitivity in that specific direction, but they can't really hear telepathic signals from other sources. The best example of a powerful psychic sophont species would probably be the loonies. The loonies live on the lunar surface, hence the name, and resemble large crustacean-like turtles, or at least some form of shelled vertebrate analog. Their long tail acts as a receiver antenna with a spinal cord possessing extremely sensitive psychic tissue. The body contains glands and organs for psychic gleaning, as well as a telepathic broadcaster near the head region. These traits endow the loonies with psychic abilities strong enough to read about 3.5 million human minds simultaneously, constantly monitoring the Earth's psychosphere for major threats. This is also part of why they're called the loonies, because it's almost as if they've gone crazy from hearing so many voices. The species was created not by the radiolith, but by a different antenniv, who really acts as the patron deity of sophonts, and thus they were created with a specific task in mind. That's kind of what their purpose is really centered around. Transmissive psi, also known as telepathy, involves the emission of certain signals. These are telepathic broadcasts which transmit information, and the information is typically understandable regardless of language, as the message is made of pure thought. However, one can train themselves to transmit information encoded in a certain language to ensure that less people understand it, which would be useful if you were trying to convey some sort of secret. Now, telepathic tissue emits signals equally in all directions and can be drawn as double-stroked lines, either on their own or curved into a larger blobby shape to actually represent planar tissue. Sometimes, as with directionally specialized psychic tissue, telepathic tissues can appear in a modified form that generates telepathic emissions from one specific direction. In the case of telepathy, then this tissue would be drawn with a triple stroke kind of in the shape of a cup, and that points in the direction of the broadcasts. Now, all humans possess weak psychic ability, being able to receive telepathic messages via their spine, which acts as a psychic antenna, as it does in loonies. However, not all humans are telepaths. Most humans are not capable of emitting telepathic signals, and those who possess this psi ability are generally only capable of transmitting information. A human telepath's upper brain typically acts as the area that broadcasts the signals, but note that not all signals are necessarily messages. Some individuals may be able to create commands, enabling mind control, or even a cloaking effect in which the broadcasting telepath prompts the others to ignore its presence. So it's almost as if you're walking around and you're constantly emitting a signal that says, "Forget I'm here," or "Ignore me." And then also, I wanted to add that the whole thing with directional specialization is actually a real phenomena in real-life radio antenna. Well, not specifically radio antenna, but just antenna in general. You can, in fact, make them where they emit in one direction specifically. Lastly, null-type tissue inhibits the direct travel of telepathy. This is accomplished by the fact that the tissue blocks telepathic beams and signals. Telepathy-inhibiting tissue completely blocks these signals, but the organism does not register or sense them, as opposed to psychic tissue. Now, telepathy-inhibiting tissue can be thought of as a wall that blocks any telepathy from passing through it, but the other null tissue type is present as telepathy-reflecting tissue, which creates a surface that simply redirects telepathic beams by reflecting them in another direction. The spoonies, a subspecies of loony named after their circular appearance, evolved on the far side of the moon. By 2110, they had developed a distinctly rounded appearance, and essentially, their psychic gleaning tissue was lost in favor of a reflective layer of null-type tissue. So their concave backs are very similar to the parabolic mirrors and parabolic dishes used to detect and gather EM waves. Now, these are real-world things. People use them for television. There's different astronomical observatories that use these, but on a giant scale. But anyways, the spoonies developed these specifically to help them eavesdrop on what's happening in space. So it acts, again, it's that parabolic dish shape, and basically it helps them collect within that dish telepathic background noise from outside Earth's psychosphere using those reflective properties. The tail of a spoonie is modified to exhibit more psychic receivers, and then that's actually arched over their back and moved into the focus point where all those signals are, focused, where they're concentrated. This allows the spoonies to check for deep space threats at will. It also allows them to turn off their ability by removing their tail, as when focused, the telepathic gibberish of space is enough to make even a loony go mad. Now, you might be wondering why I covered the powers in this order, especially when the earlier descriptions reference the ones that happened later in the video. Now, I presented them in this order for a specific reason. Manipulative, acquisitive, and transmissive, when listed in a certain order, can be abbreviated into MAT, thus making psi tissue a psi-mat substance, in the same way that corrosive liquids and acids are a hazmat substance. Also, notice that the symbol for manipulative looks like a zigzag shape, but also with an M. That's because it almost seems reminiscent of a wave, and obviously M for manipulative. Also notice that acquisitive looks like an A, transmissive looks like a T, and those two, because they're based off antenna, they contain the real world antenna symbol, but for this fictional version, for the psychic/acquisitive and for the telepathic/transmissive. So anyways, that's my magic system, or at least one of them. Remember, Psi is only half the system, and we have yet to cover true magic, which if you like this video and you thought it was kind of crazy, then you're definitely going to want to see the next one. I would like to note that I apologize for getting this video out so late. It's still technically releasing a video once every month, like I said, but I understand this is cutting it pretty close in terms of timing, and thus I'll attempt to get another video out relatively soon. I plan on making the next episode the explanation of the second magic system, but I might end up covering something different. Let me know what you think in the comments, and if this world building project is intriguing, check out the website, subscribe if you feel inclined, and see you all later.